This is the disturbing World War II weapons iceberg. Tier 1. The atomic bombs. It's 1945. The biggest war in history is still raging. Germany has surrendered, but Japan refuses to give up. The fighting in the Pacific has turned into a brutal meat grinder where everyone is dying. The American leaders look at the map and realize that invading Japan on foot would cost millions of lives. So they make a choice. They decide to unleash a weapon that changes warfare forever. In the summer of 1945, the United States made a final, irreversible decision. It dropped Little Boy and Fat Man, the first nuclear bombs ever used in war. On August 6, a B-29 dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima. It detonated about 600 meters in the air and released the energy of 15,000 tons of TNT. The center of the city pretty much disappeared, and temperatures near ground zero hit levels comparable to the sun. Some people were vaporized instantly, leaving nothing but their silhouettes etched into walls. The shockwave flattened buildings for miles, and by the end of that day, around 66,000 people were dead, with nearly 70,000 more injured. 3 days later, Nagasaki was hit with Fat Man, a plutonium bomb that added another 39,000 people to the death toll. By the end of 1945, the total number of victims had passed 214,000. Including both those killed and survivors suffering from radiation sickness, burns, and lasting injuries. A large number of the victims were children. The survivors, known as the hibakusha, didn't come out of it unharmed. Radiation sickness hit first, with hair falling out, gums bleeding, skin peeling, and fevers that left many confused and disoriented. Those who lived through that often faced lifelong health problems like leukemia, other cancers, and birth defects. Many were also treated like outcasts because people believed they were contagious. The damage wasn't just physical. Long after the fires went out, survivors dealt with flashbacks, survivor's guilt, and emotional breakdowns. The bombs ended the war, but they also opened a door humanity's been terrified of ever since. Little Boy and Fat Man forced every country on Earth to realize we now had the power to delete humankind in seconds. Operation Vegetarian Cakes. It's 1944 in Germany, and you're standing in a quiet farmland. The cows are moving slowly, and nothing seems dangerous. Then you notice these small brown feed cakes scattered all over the fields, lying there like regular cattle snacks. A cow walks up, takes a bite, and everything still looks normal for a moment. But then the animal starts getting sick, and the sickness needs to be contained. It moves through the herd, through the people who handle the meat, and eventually into the soil itself. In 1942, British scientists at Porton Down designed linseed cattle feed cakes laced with anthrax spores, millions of them. The idea was simple and horrifying. Drop the cakes onto German pastures, let cows eat them, and watch a nationwide chain reaction begin. The livestock would die, the meat would infect civilians, the soil would become contaminated for decades, and Germany's food system would collapse. The British manufactured over 5 million anthrax cakes, each infused with deadly concentrations of Bacillus anthracis. For Phase 2, aircraft racks were modified to scatter them over grazing land in northern Germany during summer, when cattle were most exposed. If deployed, the attack would have killed millions of animals within days. British planners openly calculated that famine, economic collapse, and civilian mass casualties would follow in record time. It was essentially a plan to starve a nation to death. The science backing this plan was tested in one of the bleakest wartime experiments. In 1942, Porton Down tested both anthrax bombs and the poison cakes on Grenard Island off Scotland. Every one of the 60 sheep used in the test died. Spores drifted across the water and even killed some mainland animals. The island remained so contaminated it was quarantined from 1943 to 1990. That was all the proof the planners needed. Operation Vegetarian reached full readiness by 1944, but timing killed the plan. The Allied invasion of Normandy made it irrelevant. Germany was losing the war through conventional means, so deliberately poisoning an entire country became unnecessary. The anthrax cakes were incinerated after the war, and the project stayed hidden for decades. Ethically, it crossed every line. It was a biological weapon aimed almost entirely at civilians, in direct violation of the Geneva Protocol. It would have caused slow, agonizing deaths and left the land unusable for years. Even though it was never deployed, Operation Vegetarian remains one of the darkest ideas to emerge from the Allied side of the war. The V-2 rocket. Imagine waking up, walking to work, and the next thing you know, the street behind you has been turned into a crater by something you never heard coming. No sirens, no warning. Just a buzzing engine overhead, just boom. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was losing the war. The Allies had already landed in France and were pushing toward Berlin. Hitler was desperate. His air force had been decimated, so he couldn't bomb Britain with planes anymore. Instead, he turned to his wonder weapons. He called them the vengeance weapons, or Vergeltutsenwaffe. They were designed to strike back at the Allies and terrorize civilians without risking a single German pilot. The first version was the V-1 flying bomb. People called them doodlebugs or buzz bombs because they had a rough pulse jet engine that made a loud noise. It was terrifying, but at least it had the decency to announce itself. When the buzzing stopped, you know it was about to drop, so you had a few seconds to take cover. But the V-2 was different. This was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It weighed roughly 14 tons, shot into the sky on a liquid fuel engine, arced over 80 kilometers high, then dropped back down at supersonic speed. Because it moved faster than the speed of sound, silence was the only warning you got. By the time you heard the sonic boom, the explosion had already happened. Germany fired about 3,000 of them. They rained down on streets, markets, and cinemas in London and the Belgian city of Antwerp. It was completely random. You could be buying groceries one second and vaporized the next. This unpredictability shattered morale. Civilians who thought the air raids were finally over realized that death could now drop from space at any moment. About 20,000 concentration camp prisoners died building these rockets, which ironically was more than the V-2s ever killed in combat. So to put it simply, the vengeance weapon murdered its makers more than its enemies. And even though it didn't do much to change the outcome of World War II, it opened the door to the missile age. ICBMs, Cold War standoffs, and nuclear warheads. Humanity got a taste of what remote, unstoppable destruction looks like, and we never put that genie back in the bottle. The S-Mine. It's 1943 in northern France, and you and your friend are walking across a field that looks completely empty and safe. But suddenly, your friend steps on something hidden under the dirt, and you both hear a sharp click. Nothing happens for a moment, and he tries to lift his foot, confused. But then, a metal tube shoots straight out of the ground right in front of him, jumping up to about his waist. Before he can move, the tube explodes in midair. Hundreds of steel balls blast out in every direction, hitting his legs and lower body at full force. He drops instantly, and you realize the explosion came from a buried device built to jump before it fires. Now you're scared to even take another step. You crouch down and start checking the ground with anything long you can find, trying to spot more hidden objects just like that one, because one mistake is all it takes for another one to jump. The Germans officially called this device the Shrapnellmine 35, but the guys on the field just called it the Bouncing Betty. The Bouncing Betty was built for defensive warfare. It was a metal cylinder buried in the ground, packed with about 360 steel balls. Basically, it was a shotgun and a grenade rolled into one, and it jumped out of the dirt to hit anything in the groin. It worked like this. A pressure plate or tripwire set it off. There was a short delay, just long enough to give you false hope. Then, a small charge launched the mine about a meter into the air, and mid-jump, the main TNT exploded, sending steel flying at waist and groin height. It was lethal within roughly 20 meters, and could still wound people well past 100. One mine was more than enough to wreck an entire squad. With Bouncing Betty losing legs, lower body, or even genitals was a very real outcome. That alone wrecked morale. Soldiers moved through suspected minefields in slow motion, prodding the ground with bayonets, trying to spot prongs in the soil, knowing that one mistake could end their lives in the worst possible way. German records actually showed that the fear of these mines slowed down the enemy more than the actual explosions. The Germans knew this, so retreating units often left S-mines behind on timers or tripwires just to punish anyone following them. Even after the war was over, the danger lingered. Unexploded S-mines sat in the ground, maiming anyone who stumbled across them. Farmers, children, anyone in the wrong place. Napalm. Imagine you're a civilian in Tokyo in 1945. The city is burning. You try to run to the Sumida River to escape, but the water is boiling. Even staying on the surface is deadly. The air is so hot your backpack catches fire while you're wearing it. This destruction comes from a new weapon called napalm. It was developed in 1942 as a chemistry experiment, made by mixing gasoline with aluminum salts to create a sticky, slow-burning gel. It burned at temperatures reaching 800 to 1200 degrees Celsius, or roughly 1500 to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot enough to melt metal. Unlike normal fuel that splashes or evaporates, napalm attaches itself to whatever it touches, including skin, and keeps burning. By 1945, American B-29s were dropping thousands of M69 napalm bomblets on Japanese cities. Upon impact, they ejected burning gel that clung to surfaces and burned everything nearby. The bomblets were specially designed to punch through thin wooden roofs and set the building on fire from the inside. Tokyo, at the time, was full of tightly packed wooden buildings, which made it an easy target. That's how Operation Meeting House came about. On the night of March 9, 1945, U.S. General Curtis LeMay sent a huge fleet of bombers to fly low and drop thousands of tons of firebombs on the city. The result was horrific. The firestorm destroyed 16 square miles and killed about 100,000 people in a single night, making it the deadliest air raid in history. Over the next few months, the U.S. military did this again and again. Dozens of cities like Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and more were hit with similar attacks. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and millions were left homeless. By August 1945, firebombing and the atomic bombs together had killed roughly 400,000 people in Japan. The napalm caused a lot of people to burn to death, but it also brought a secondary killer. The flames consumed oxygen so quickly that the air turned lethal. Many victims didn't even touch the fire. They suffocated because the fire used up all the air. Water didn't help either. It often made things worse by spreading the burning gel. Apart from burning entire cities, napalm also reshaped ground warfare. In the Pacific, it cleared jungles, destroyed bunkers, and forced defenders out of hiding. Napalm killed more people in Tokyo in one night than the initial blasts at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. But the military never stops at effective. Once burning gel became normal, they looked for something even crueler. Something that could burn through smoke, through rain, through flesh and bone, all the way to the marrow. We will talk about that first thing in Tier 2, M2 Flamethrower. Imagine you're an American Marine on a Pacific island. It's hot, you're soaked in sweat, and a 30-kilo metal tank is strapped to your back. Ahead of you is a dark cave entrance, quiet and still, with enemy soldiers hidden inside where you can't see them. You step forward, aim the nozzle, and pull the trigger. Burning jelly blasts out, hitting the rock face, and slides into the cave like a river of fire. Anyone inside has nowhere to go. That sounds horrifying for the people on the receiving end, but what doesn't get talked about as much is how miserable that job was for the person holding the weapon. During World War II, flamethrower operators were prime targets. Japanese troops were trained to shoot them first, because taking out one man could neutralize the weapon entirely. The weapon in question was the M2 Flamethrower. The Americans used it throughout the war, and while it showed up in Europe against German forces, it became legendary in the Pacific War against Japan. On islands like Iwo Jima, which was a small volcanic crater the US needed to capture, the Japanese forces lived inside entire underground systems. We're talking interconnected tunnels, reinforced caves, and concrete bunkers. In these places, regular weapons were useless. Grenades bounced off the rocks and artillery couldn't reach deep enough. Plus, the caves were booby-trapped, so any Marine who tried to walk in was signing up for a one-way tour. So the Americans brought in the M2. The design was simple. The operator carried a heavy backpack with two main tanks containing napalm gel. When the soldier pulled the trigger, compressed gas shot the gel out of a nozzle and ignited it. This created a stream of burning jelly that could shoot up to 40 meters. And here's the terrifying part. Unlike bullets, fire doesn't have to travel in a straight line. The burning liquid could splash against walls, go around corners, and flow deep into the tunnels. It also sucked all the oxygen out of the enclosed space, so even if the fire didn't touch the enemy, they would suffocate. The M2 was pretty effective, but using it came at a price. The full kit weighed more than 30 kilos. That's a lot to carry while trying to dodge bullets. If a bullet hit your tank, you could be covered in burning fuel instantly. A Marine Corps analysis after Iwo Jima recorded a casualty rate of 92% for one flamethrower unit. Some estimates claimed the average survival time on the battlefield was just 4 minutes. After the stats were released, the Marines realized they needed the same firepower, just without the human sacrifice attached. So they strapped the flamethrower to something the Japanese couldn't take out with bullets. We'll talk more about that in Tier 2. Tier 2, the M4 Sherman ZIPPO. After watching too many portable flamethrower operations get turned into human fireworks, engineers decided it was the best time to do something about it. They took a regular Sherman tank, stripped out the main cannon, and replaced it with a giant flame nozzle. But they didn't leave it exposed. They slid the whole thing inside a fake metal tube shaped exactly like the original gun barrel. That disguise was super important because Japanese anti-tank crews would blow up anything that looked like a flamethrower on sight. The pressure system in the M4 Sherman could blast thickened napalm up to 140 meters, turning the flame stream into a straight-up fire hose. And caves were basically its dream target. The fire splashed, flowed, and stuck. If it hit the mouth of a tunnel, it crept around corners, coated the walls, sucked out the oxygen, and turned the inside into a sealed oven. A bunker that could shrug off artillery for days could be finished in under a minute once a flame tank rolled up. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, these tanks were the ultimate weapon. Infantry would be pinned down all morning by a machine gun nest. Then a Zippo would run up and turn tables in one 10-second blast. Even Japanese fighters admitted that the fire tanks caused levels of panic standard weapons never could. The Japanese code of honor taught them to fight to the death, but it didn't teach them how to fight a tank that breathes fire. Of course, driving a giant metal box full of gasoline gel wasn't exactly anyone's dream job. A single Japanese anti-tank round could cook the crew alive instantly. So crew members started welding spare tracks all over the hull and slapping wooden planks on the sides to stop magnetic mines. This weapon was horrific for the people inside the caves, but for the Marines outside, it was the only thing that kept the war from dragging on for months longer. White phosphorus. It's 1944 in Normandy, and you're hiding inside a dugout while the shelling outside keeps getting louder. Something bursts in the sky above you, and burning flakes start falling through the air. At first, they look harmless, but the moment they touch the open air inside the dugout, they burst into bright fire and thick white smoke. The smoke burns your eyes and throat, and when one piece lands on your sleeve, it sticks to your skin. You try to put it out, but the fire only stops while it's underwater, and the second it's exposed again, it lights back up right inside the wound. White phosphorus, or WP, is a yellowish waxy solid that ignites automatically when exposed to oxygen. Once it starts burning, it hits extremely high temperatures and produces thick, choking white smoke. This combination of fire and smoke made it one of the scariest things you could see on a battlefield. Everyone had it. The US, Britain, Germany, and even Japan. It was stuffed into grenades, mortar shells, artillery rounds, bombs, you name it. Officially, WP was for smoke screens. To hide your friends while they moved across a field. But unofficially, soldiers knew it did a lot more. In Normandy, American troops used this stuff like it was free. Roughly 1 in every 5 mortar rounds fired by the US was a white phosphorus shell. There was one mortar unit in the city of Cherbourg that fired nearly 12,000 of these rounds just to force the Germans out of their holes. Even Medal of Honor reports from 1944 talk about soldiers tossing WP grenades into machine gun nests. When bullets didn't work, burning chemicals usually did the trick. The American Sherman tanks often struggled to destroy the heavy German Panzer tanks with just armor-piercing shells. So they started shooting white phosphorus at them instead. The WP didn't blow up the German tank, but the burning smoke would get sucked right into the tank's ventilation system. The inexperienced German crew members would panic, think their tank was on fire, and jump out. Basically, the Allies tricked them into abandoning a perfectly good tank without ever penetrating the armor. When WP hits human flesh, things turned nightmarish. The burning wax stuck to skin, uniforms, and even the walls of the dugout. In caves, the heat and toxic smoke gave defenders 2 choices: leave cover or die choking. Water didn't help much either. It stopped the burning only while the wound was underwater. Once the affected area dried off, it would catch fire again right inside the wound. Psychologically, this wrecked morale. Troops would panic and break cover just to get away from the smoke. Even the Japanese forces, who were famous for fighting to the death, were seen running away from caves when the phosphorus started going in. WP wasn't banned, and it wasn't illegal, so everyone used it. But even back then, the medics who had to treat the smoking wounds quietly wondered if they had crossed the line. The MG-42. Imagine you and your unit moving across frozen farmland on the Eastern Front. You're halfway through an open stretch when a sudden ripping sound tears through the cold air. The snow in front of you erupts in a straight line. Then another line slices past your shoulder, both coming from a single German position you can barely make out. You hit the ground as the noise keeps going without pause, and lying there, it clicks that whatever is firing is throwing out so many rounds per second that standing up would feel like walking into a spinning blade. The device firing was the MG42. It fired 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. At that speed, the human ear stops hearing individual shots and just registers one thing: continuous scream. In that chaos, all you saw were tracers streaking through the air, cutting everything in their path. Germany rolled out the MG42 in 1942 as a faster, cheaper upgrade of the MG34. They cut the factory time from 150 man-hours down to 75, switched to stamped steel parts, and ended up producing over 400,000 of them. It fired the standard 7.92 by 57mm cartridge, and it was light enough for infantry to carry with a bipod or set on a tripod for defense. A German infantry squad wasn't a group of riflemen with a machine gun. The MG42 was the squad. The gunner and assistant operated the weapon, while the other 6 men existed solely to carry ammo and protect the gun. On the battlefield, the numbers got ugly fast. A single MG42 could delete a charging squad before anyone realized what was happening. At Anzio and on the Eastern Front, German machine gun teams used overlapping fields of fire so well that moving through them was almost impossible. Any Allied unit caught in those lanes was exposed to constant, precise MG42 fire from multiple targets. The gun did have one flaw: it melted barrels. It fired so hot that crews had to swap the barrel every few hundred rounds. Allied troops were taught to attack during this pause, but catching them at that moment was nearly impossible, because a good German crew could swap a red-hot barrel for a cold one in under 5 seconds. The MG42 was so terrifying that the US Army had to produce propaganda to stop recruits from panicking. Training films claimed the gun's bark was worse than its bite, and that it wasted ammo. It was a comforting lie. On the battlefield, no pep talk could prepare you for 25 bullets hitting your position every single second. Exploding rats. You spot a dead rat on the factory floor, stiff and blackened with soot, and it should be the least important thing in the room. Then you remember the Gestapo warning from earlier that day. They said the British were planting rat bombs, and that any one of them could go off at any moment. One wrong move could set off the boiler and take the whole place with it. So now you're frozen, staring at a dead animal that might or might not blow the factory sky high. When people think of secret weapons, they usually picture guns or explosives. Dead rats never make the list. But in 1941, the British spy agency, known as the SOE, decided that dead rodents were the perfect Trojan horse for sabotage. Agents procured around 100 rat carcasses, skinned them, filled the hides with plastic explosive, stitched them back up, and planned to drop them near coal piles in German factories and train stations. The logic was simple. Workers usually tossed dead rats straight into furnaces, and once that happened, the rat would explode inside the firebox, ideally triggering a much larger boiler explosion. In theory, these explosions could disrupt production in German industrial sites. This was exactly the kind of sabotage SOE was designed to do. But the funny part is, the operation failed spectacularly before a single rat exploded. The first shipment was intercepted by the Germans in late 1941. A crate containing the explosive rats were seized by the Gestapo, who immediately displayed them at military schools to warn officers about this new threat. But the British still considered this a win. The Germans were so terrified of the rat bombs that they launched a full-scale, continent-wide search. Boiler rooms, coal piles, trash heaps, thousands of man-hours were wasted hunting for rodents that didn't exist. Rumors later circulated claiming exploding rats destroyed 9 boilers in Belgium, but post-war analysis found no evidence. It was most likely just mythology or British trolling. The weapons still did damage, though. German soldiers had to treat every dead rat like it was a grenade. A janitor couldn't even do basic cleanup without worrying he might be holding a bomb. Even though the boilers never blew, the Germans wasted time and energy chasing ghosts. Tier 3. Bat bombs. Imagine you live in a quiet Japanese neighborhood and you look up at the sky. A plane drops a large metal container, but it does not hit the ground and explode. Instead, it pops open high in the air. Thousands of bats fly out and scatter into the dark attics of every house in the city. You don't realize what happened until 15 minutes later when smoke starts coming out of your roof, and then your neighbor's roof, and then the entire city turns into a sea of fire. This sounds crazy, but World War II actually reached a point where bats were considered a real weapon. The idea came from Little S. Adams, a Pennsylvania dentist who was visiting Carlsbad Caverns in 1942. He realized that bats could be useful against Japan because Japanese cities were full of wooden and paper houses, and he noticed that bats loved hiding inside dark attics during the day. His plan was to freeze thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats into hibernation, strap small napalm charges to them, pack them into a bomb-shaped canister, and drop it at dawn. The casing would open in the sky. The bats would wake up, fly into attics across the city, and minutes later, thousands of fires would start at the exact same time. It was called Project X, and as ridiculous as it sounds, the idea got real backing. President Roosevelt forwarded the concept with a note, "worth looking into." And then the military brought in a zoologist, the inventor of napalm, and even a Hollywood animal trainer. They built a 1.5-meter tall canister that held over 1,000 bats in stacked trays, and they kept the bats asleep with ice before gluing the firebombs to their chests. Testing was chaotic. At Carlsbad Army Airfield, some bats woke early, flew into a fuel tank and under a general's car, and burned down part of the test range. Ironically, that disaster proved the concept. Later, in a mock Japanese village in Utah, the bats infiltrated rooftops and triggered dozens of fires despite their tiny charges. Analysts estimated that just one plane dropping these bat bombs could start over 3,000 fires. That was way more destruction than regular firebombs could ever hope to achieve. Everything seemed to be on track, but then the project fell behind schedule. By 1944, the Manhattan Project was winning the race for resources. Admiral Ernest J. King decided he didn't want a bat army anymore, so he canceled the project. By then, they'd already spent about $2 million on preparations, and not a single bat bomb ever saw combat. The only thing the bats ever actually destroyed was their own test base. Project Pigeon. It's 1944, on the deck of a Japanese transport ship moving supplies toward the coast. Everything looks normal until someone spots a bomb falling toward them. It isn't diving like a regular bomb, it's gliding, slowly adjusting its direction as if something inside is steering it. The crew starts trying to outmaneuver the bomb, but no matter how the ship turns, the thing keeps zeroing in on the ship like it can see exactly where it needs to hit. After the US tried to drop thousands of incendiary bats on Japan, you'd think the military had reached its limits for animal-based weaponry. But no. The next logical step, apparently, was to put pigeons in charge of steering guided bombs. That plan was called Project Pigeon. It was created by a psychologist named B.F. Skinner, who thought trained birds could steer bombs just by pecking at a screen. As crazy as it sounds, his idea got real funding, a real code name, and real prototypes. Skinner's setup was strange but simple. They would place 3 pigeons inside the nose of a bomb. Each bird sat in front of its own little round screen. A lens on the front of the bomb projected the target's image onto those screens. If the bomb drifted off course, the image shifted. The pigeons were trained to peck the center of that image and would immediately peck the direction it moved in. Each peck triggered tiny electrical contacts that controlled the bomb's fins. Because there were 3 pigeons working at once, the system acted like a vote. If 2 birds pecked left and 1 pecked right, the bomb turned left. The scariest part about this whole thing is that it actually worked really well. In tests, pigeons kept the image centered even while the chambers spun, rattled, and blasted noise at them. One bird pecked the target 10,000 times in 45 minutes without getting distracted. Skinner considered that undeniable proof the system was ready. By 1944, everything was functional, but electronics were catching up fast. Radar and radio-guided bombs were already showing more serious promise, so the Navy shelved Project Pigeon. They briefly reopened it in 1948 as Project Orkan, then shut it down permanently in 1953 once new tech made the birds unnecessary. The pigeons never went to war. Not because they couldn't do the job, but because no one wanted to explain to Congress why the military was putting birds in charge of national security. Ethically, it sits in a weird gray zone. The pigeons weren't harmed during training, and tests showed they handled stress well, but they were still being strapped into a bomb they wouldn't survive, which made them kamikaze pilots without the informed consent. But what's interesting is Japan had a similar weapon too, except they didn't use pigeons. We'll talk about that in Tier 4. Soviet anti-tank dogs. Imagine you're standing next to your Panzer tank when you hear barking somewhere in the smoke. At first, it just sounds like farm dogs, so you brush it off. Then a dog suddenly comes out of the haze with what looks like a wooden trigger bar strapped to its back. You and your crew freeze, totally confused about what you're looking at. The dog bolts straight under the tank, and the next thing you know, everything goes white. You'd assume turning bats into firebombs and pigeons into missiles was as bad as it got. It wasn't. The Soviet Union found a way to make it worse by strapping explosives to dogs. The idea started in the 1930s, when Soviet trainers tried using dogs to deliver explosives to targets. At first, the plan was considered humane, at least compared to what it later turned into. The dogs were meant to drop the pack, pull a release cord with their teeth, and run back. But the problem was, the dogs didn't understand the assignment. They often ran back to their trainer while carrying the live bomb because they wanted a treat. By 1940, the Red Army abandoned the original method and changed tactics. They strapped a 10 to 12 kilogram mine to a dog's back, with a tall wooden rod fixed on top. When the dog ran under a tank, the rod would strike the metal underside and set off an explosion, killing the animal and the tank's occupants. When the Germans invaded in 1941, the program escalated fast. Training was based on hunger conditioning. Dogs were kept half-starved, and their food was placed under stationary tanks so they'd associate the underside with a meal. Trainers then added moving engines, gunfire, and combat noise. It worked in theory, except for one fatal detail. Soviet tanks used diesel engines. German panzers ran on gasoline. On a battlefield full of stress and noise, the dog got confused. They ignored the strange-smelling German tanks and sprinted toward the familiar diesel scent of the Soviet lines. It was a disaster. In the first big attack in 1941, 30 dogs were sent out. Only 4 blew up German tanks. 6 ran back and exploded in the Soviet trenches and killed their own trainers. The rest were either shot or ran off. Despite this outcome, the Red Army kept using the anti-tank dogs well into 1942 at big battles, like Stalingrad. Soviet reports claim these dogs destroyed about 300 German tanks, but according to military historians like Steven Zaloga, who analyzed the actual records, that number was mostly propaganda. The Germans figured out what was happening in record time, so they started shooting every dog they saw. They even used flamethrowers and aimed their machine guns to the ground just to stop them. By mid-1943, the element of surprise was gone, and the dog units were disbanded or reassigned. The program psychologically broke everyone involved. Handlers spent months training a dog, then had to watch it run to its death, or worse, had to shoot it themselves if it panicked and returned. Some trainers refused to work with new dogs and were sent to the gulag. Ethically, it was just cruelty framed as strategy. The dogs didn't understand what was happening, couldn't consent, and had no real chance of survival. But on the Eastern Front, Soviet commanders treated them as equipment, not living animals. Tier 4. Yokosuka MXY OHKA. Imagine you're manning a gun mount on an Allied cruiser when the radar operator calls out a fast-moving blip, way quicker than any normal aircraft. You scan the sky and catch a glimpse of a small plane diving straight toward the fleet. It doesn't move like a fighter, and it's closing the distance so fast your crew can barely track it. By the time you understand what you're looking at, your ship is already sinking. While the US was trying to make guidance smarter with pigeons, Japan skipped the birds and just used people instead. The result was the OHKA, which ironically means cherry blossom. Despite its pretty name, it was built for one job and one job only: to slam a 1,200 kilogram warhead into an Allied warship at high speed. The Allies called it the Baka bomb, which is Japanese for idiot, but the weapon itself was terrifying. The OHKA emerged in 1944, when a naval officer pitched the idea of a human-guided glider bomb. The logic was that with no guidance systems and no electronics, there was nothing for the Allies to jam. You took a big explosive charge, attached it to a small airframe, bolted on 3 rocket motors, and let a volunteer handle the aiming. It was a guaranteed one-way trip. The aircraft had no landing gear, and the pilot had no parachute. If he hit the ship, he died. If he missed and ran out of fuel, he still died. There was no version of this where anyone came back. By the fall of that year, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal had working prototypes, and the Model 11 became the main production version. The OHKA also couldn't take off on its own. There was no runway involved at all. Instead, it was carried under the belly of a large, slow bomber called the G4M, better known as Betty. That bomber hauled the OHKA toward the enemy fleet. Once they got within about 37 kilometers, the Betty released it. The pilot inside took over from there. At first, the pilot just glided toward the fleet to save fuel. Then, once the target was close enough to fill the cockpit window, he fired all 3 rocket motors. The OHKA lurched forward at around 650 kilometers per hour, and in a dive, it could push past 1,000. That kind of speed gave Allied gunners only a few seconds to react. The warhead in the nose weighed about 1,200 kilograms. That's an absurd amount of explosives. Even a near miss could still wreck a destroyer from the shockwave alone. On paper, this sounded like a nightmare weapon. In practice, the problem was obvious. The OHKA itself was fast, but the bomber carrying it wasn't. The Betty was slow, fragile, and easy to spot, and American fighter patrols tore them apart long before they got anywhere near release range. Japan built more than 850 OHKAs, yet only a small fraction were ever dropped in combat. Most of the time, the weapon failed, but not always. On April 12, 1945, an OHKA hit the USS Manert L. Abel and snapped the ship in half, making it the first vessel sunk by one. Another detonated close enough to the USS Jeffers to cause severe damage. And one strike on the USS Stanley was moving so fast, it punched straight through the hull and exited out the other side. The damage was impressive, but direct hits were extremely rare. During the Okinawa campaign, roughly 300 OHKAs were assigned, but only 74 were actually launched, and most were intercepted or missed their targets. Still, Japan presented the pilots, many of them just 17 to 22 years old, as heroes of the so-called Special Attack Units. They were expected to write farewell notes, climb into cockpits barely bigger than coffins, and take off knowing there was no return trip. From a strategic point of view, though, it was a terrible trade. Dozens of pilots were lost for very little impact. Lunge mine. It's early 1945 in the Philippines, and your Sherman tank is crawling down a narrow village road with infantry moving alongside it. The place feels quiet, almost too quiet, until one of the riflemen suddenly yells and points ahead. An enemy soldier is charging straight at the tank, holding a long pole with a metal cone on the end. The infantry open fire, but he doesn't slow down. He reaches the tank, slams the cone into the side armor, and a split second later, the explosion tears the Sherman apart, throwing bodies and metal across the road. If the OHKA was Japan's airborne version of Get Close and Explode, then the Lunge mine was the ground edition. It used the exact same idea, and the person operating it had a zero chance of surviving. The Lunge mine is, for all intents and purposes, a bomb on a stick. You run at a tank with it, thrust the spikes into the hull, and that was it. The thing weighed 6.5 kilos, sat on a 1.5 to 2 meter pole, and could punch through 150 millimeters of armor, which is great, except the blast radius was everyone within 5 meters. It was designed to destroy the tank, the soldier holding the bomb, and anyone else nearby in one big ugly explosion. The weapon showed up around late 1944, right when Japan had run out of actual anti-tank guns and had to rely on crazy last resort ideas. By that point, they'd tried satchel charges, Molotovs, and a lot of wishful thinking. The Type 3 lunge mine was where the whole suicide anti-tank idea became official policy. The first real encounters happened in the Philippines, and American intelligence immediately flagged it as one of the bleakest weapons they'd ever seen. Most of the attempts failed outright because the soldiers carrying the mines were shot long before they could ever get close to a tank. On the battlefield, it only worked in rare situations, like in Okinawa, when one attacker actually managed to reach a Sherman and blow the suspension apart. But that was one incident. For every partial success, dozens of soldiers died meters away from their target. American tank crews started moving with heavy infantry screens because the last thing you want while sitting in a steel box is someone sprinting at you with a bomb on a spear. As horrifying as it is, this idea did not stay in Japan. During the war against the French in Vietnam, Viet Minh fighters found some leftover mines and used them. In 1946, a photographer took a famous picture of a soldier in Hanoi holding a lunge mine. He looked ready to fight a tank all by himself, and eventually became a national icon. But the reality was grim. He did not survive, and reports say the mine actually failed to go off. In the end, the lunge mine achieved almost nothing. It didn't stop the US advance, didn't shift any battles, and mostly increased Japanese casualties. It was what you could call an all-around failure. Fukuryu divers. Imagine you're a soldier riding in a crowded US landing craft heading toward the beach for a Japanese invasion. The water looks calm, and nothing seems wrong until the boat jerks suddenly, like it hit something solid under the surface. Before anyone can react, a blast erupts from beneath the hull, throwing men into the air and snapping the boat in half. Crashing missiles and people sprinting at tanks with explosives didn't stop the Americans, so Japan looked to the only direction it hadn't tried yet, down. The plan showed up in late 1944, right when Japan started realizing the Allies were not slowing down. Saipan fell, the Philippines fell, Okinawa was burning, and the invasion of mainland Japan was scheduled for tomorrow. So the Navy created a new special attack unit. Men who would literally crouch underwater for hours and blow themselves up beneath landing craft called the FUKURYU divers. Each diver wore a rubber diving suit, a metal helmet, and a rebreather that could keep them underwater for up to 10 hours. With 9 kilos of lead weights, they'd walk along the seabed at 5 to 7 meters deep, moving slowly like ghosts anchored to the bottom. Their weapon was a 5-meter bamboo pole with a 10-kilogram explosive mine on the end. The tactic was simple. Wait in the dark until an allied craft passed overhead, then push upward and slam the mine into the hull. The blast would destroy the vessel and the diver. Japan planned to train 4,000 men by July 1945. In reality, only around 1,200 completed the course, and equipment shortages meant only about 600 suits existed. The rest were just names on training rosters. Even so, Japan built an entire defensive layout for them. Lines of sea mines offshore, then rows of FUKURYU spaced roughly 20 meters apart closer to the beach. Some were even assigned to underwater concrete bunkers so they could hide below the waves for days before an invasion. Training accidents were constant. Faculty gear drowned men. Others collapsed from oxygen issues or decompression sickness. The ocean itself was already trying to kill them before the enemy ever arrived. As for whether the FUKURYU were ever actually used, officially, no. They were never deployed in mass combat, and no Allied ship was ever sunk by one. The war ended before a single operational mission took place. Everything they trained for remained hypothetical. But the big question, if the invasion actually happened, would this crazy plan have worked? Based on US Navy analysis after the war, yes, at least partly. Imagine a messy beach invasion. There are boats, smoke, and there's noise everywhere. In that chaos, the divers would be invisible. If just a few of them poked their bombs into the bottom of the landing boats, those boats would sink instantly. Soldiers would drown or get blown up before they even touched the sand. This is why the US military expected so many people to die during an invasion. They knew attacks were coming from everywhere. From the sky, from the ground, and now even from under the water. Thankfully, none of it happened. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, training stopped overnight. The suits were destroyed, the mines dismantled, and the underwater bunkers sealed. The divers, many of whom had spent months expecting to die in complete darkness, simply went home. The KAITEN manned torpedoes. Imagine taking the Imperial Navy's most powerful torpedo, the Type 93 Longlands, cutting open the top and forcing a person to sit inside. That's exactly how the KAITEN worked. It was a metal tube barely wider than a human chest containing a tiny periscope, a steering wheel bolted to the hull and in the front. Over 1.5 tons of explosive, packed tight like a giant underwater battering ram. The Japanese Navy launched these things from submarines, but the process was terrifying. The KAITEN sat on the outside deck of the submarine. To get inside, the pilot had to crawl through a narrow tube while the submarine was still underwater. Once the hatch shut, the pilot was sealed in. There was no escape method that actually worked. In later models, mechanics simply welded the hatch shut. The moment the engine started, the pilot was basically gone. He just guided his own warhead into a ship at 75 kilometers per hour. The missions were advertised as noble sacrifices. In reality, most KAITEN launches fell apart before they even reached an enemy ship. The oxygen engines produced toxic fumes and immense heat. And inside a sealed metal tube, that poison had nowhere to go. Pilots simply passed out before moving a single meter. When the engines did start, the controls often stuck in one direction. The trim system was so unstable that the KAITEN behaved like a broken elevator. Some shot upward and burst out of the water, in full view of American lookouts, while others pointed downward, dug straight into the sea floor, and crushed the pilot instantly under the pressure. The rare hits were dramatic, but changed nothing. At Ulithi, one KAITEN slammed into the fleet oiler USS Mississinawa. The explosion turned the tanker into a fireball and killed 63 men, but it had zero effect on the US war effort. Months later, another KAITEN blew the destroyer escort USS Underhill in half during a close-range fight. Those were the only major sinkings. Every other attack either missed the target, malfunctioned halfway, or ended when American ships found the launch submarine and destroyed it before the KAITEN could even be released. And that was the final punch. These things made their own motherships easier to detect and destroy. Submarines carrying KAITEN had to strap them to the outer deck, which made the subs slow, loud, and blind to sonar. American destroyers and aircraft destroyed 8 of them before they could even launch. Just like the 3 self-destruct weapons before, The KAITEN was another weapon that only existed because Japan ran out of options. Tier 5. Plague Flea Bombs. It's 1940 in Ningbo, China, and you're walking through a busy open market when small white flakes start drifting down from the sky. They look like bits of cotton or ash, so people brush them off their clothes and keep shopping. No one panics. It isn't snow season, but it doesn't seem dangerous either. A few days later, people start coming down with high fevers and swollen lymph nodes. Entire households fall sick at once, and before anyone fully understands what's happening, your city is placed under quarantine. During World War II, Unit 731, a secret Japanese army group operating in China, proved you could kill thousands of people without a single explosion. They experimented on real people with biological and chemical weapons, torturing prisoners in ways that went far beyond imagination. Flea bombs were just one of their most infamous creations. In 1940, during the war between Japan and China, a Japanese aircraft flying from Hangzhou dropped plague-infected fleas mixed into grain, rice, and cotton over the Chinese city of Ningbo. Imagine looking up and seeing flakes falling from the sky. You might think it's snow or ash, but later you find out those specks were full of Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the Black Death. The mix was diabolical. The cotton protected the fleas during the fall, and the rice attracted local rats. Once the rats ate the bait, the fleas jumped onto them, starting the cycle of infection. Within days, people in Ningbo started dying from the bubonic plague, which was highly unusual since the region rarely saw outbreaks. On top of that, it was late autumn. Plague usually spreads in warmer weather when fleas are active, so seeing it strike in the cold season was completely unnatural. Medical staff sealed off the infected area with a 4-meter wall, then burned the district down to stop the spread. Records show at least 109 deaths in Ningbo, but some Japanese sources say the real number was in the thousands because the disease kept spreading. To stop it, they burned the whole neighborhood down, and for decades, that land stayed empty because people were too scared to build on it. They just called it the plague field. Japan tried similar attacks in Chuzhou. Grains laced with bacteria and fleas were scattered across the town, but the outbreak didn't explode the way Ningbo's did. Later analysis suggests the fleas were dropped at the wrong altitude or in poor weather. Turns out, plague had better performance when dropped from a lower height and in warm, humid conditions. The fact that the flea bombs didn't always work did not make the attacks any less horrific. It just meant that Chinese civilians had to treat every strange illness, every rat, and every rumor like a biological attack. Some villages carried stigma for years. And there is a scary long-term consequence to this. Researchers later found recurring plague foci in parts of northeast China that may have been seeded by Unit 731's releases. It's the kind of damage that doesn't end when the war does. After Japan surrendered, most of the people behind Unit 731 avoided persecution because the United States wanted their data on biowarfare to use against the Soviets. General Shiro Ishii and his team walked away untouched. The full story only started coming out decades later, through survivor testimony and lawsuits. Even when courts acknowledged the germ attacks happened, victims got no compensation. Operation Cherry Blossoms. After their success scattering plague-infested fleas over cities like Ningbo and Chengde, Japan concluded that they could recreate that success anywhere, even in the United States. That idea became Operation Cherry Blossoms at night. But the biggest obstacle was geography. You can drop plague bombs over nearby Chinese cities because they're a short flight away. You can't do that to California unless you somehow move an entire airbase across the Pacific without anyone noticing. Japan's Navy already had the only vessel weird enough to make that possible. The I-400 class submarines were basically underwater aircraft carriers. Each one was 122 meters long, which, for context, is larger than a football field, with a giant sealed tube on top that stored 3 Seiran attack planes. The wings and tail folded like a piece of luggage, and the entire aircraft sat inside a pressurized hangar to keep it dry. When the sub surfaced, the crew could roll out the planes, unfold them, fuel them, and launch them off a compressed air catapult in under an hour. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was built around this exact trick. 5 of these submarines would travel underwater all the way to Southern California, surface just before midnight, and launch their Seirans into the dark. Instead of bombs or torpedoes, each plane would carry plague-infected fleas. The targets were San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, and it was a one-way mission for everyone involved. Southern California's climate would keep fleas alive long enough to find new hosts, and the region had enough wild rodents to maintain transmission cycles. The plague would unfold slowly, days of incubation, then outbreaks, then more outbreaks. It would have triggered mass quarantines, port closures, and a logistical shutdown at the exact moment the United States was preparing to invade Japan. The operation was finalized on March 26, 1945, and scheduled for September 22, 1945. But it was canceled by General Yoshijiro Umezu, who understood that once biological warfare began, it wouldn't remain a Japan versus America problem. It would become a humanity versus pathogen problem. And Japan would be remembered as the country that tried to restart the Black Death. Even in the final months of the war, that consequence was too large to justify. So in the end, Operation Cherry Blossoms never happened. The war ended in August, weeks before the launch date. But every component, fleas, bombs, submarines, and aircraft already existed. The only reason Los Angeles didn't experience the same plague cycle as Ningbo is because one Japanese general decided that the moral cost was too high. Project SEAL. Imagine you're relaxing on a beach. The water is calm, the air is still, and nothing feels out of place. Then you hear a series of explosions out at sea, loud enough to notice, but far enough away that nothing seems damaged. People look around, confused, and then go back to what they were doing. A moment later, the shoreline starts to pull back, slowly at first, then more and more, until the water is just gone, and bare sand stretches out in front of you. Before anyone can really process what's happening, a single massive wave rises on the horizon and starts rolling towards the beach. In 1944, Allied scientists started researching something that sounds like a supervillain plot, a weaponized tsunami. In 1944, American and New Zealand scientists teamed up and worked together to determine if a chain of underwater explosions could generate a man-made tsunami large enough to sweep away enemy coastal cities. The idea wasn't pure fantasy. Allied engineers had noticed that bombing coral reefs sometimes kicked up unusually large waves. If a handful of blasts could do that by accident, then perhaps thousands of tons of explosives could do something even bigger and scarier on purpose. New Zealand physicist Thomas Leach led the experiments off Wangaparo Peninsula near Auckland. The location was chosen because it was remote, quiet, and most importantly, had the right seabed shape to amplify wave motion. Throughout 1944, the team detonated over 3,700 small explosive charges in different patterns. Some tests created swells large enough to confirm the idea wasn't just theoretical. Wave sensors measured every detonation, and after months of data collection, the math pointed to a mind-bending requirement. To generate a roughly 10-meter wave, the Allies would need around 2,200 tons of explosives lined up in a perfectly timed chain several kilometers offshore. A U.S. naval report reviewing the numbers called the concept potentially comparable in effect to an atomic strike, at least against coastal cities. But the weapon would never be built. In August 1945, the war ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With Japan's surrender, Project SEAL quietly shut down. New Zealand continued a few minor experiments into 1946 before shelving it completely. The tsunami bomb never advanced beyond the testing phase, and no full demonstration was ever attempted. A man-made tsunami would have flattened ports, cities, and pretty much anything near the coast. But the truth is, setting it up would have been a nightmare all by itself. You'd have to sneak thousands of tons of explosives into enemy waters without getting spotted. Then you'd need to line them up in a straight line stretching about 8 kilometers. After that, every single charge would have to detonate at the exact same moment. Miss the timing even a little and all you get is a lot of bubbles and zero wave. When you think about all those variables, it's easy to see that the atomic bomb was just easier. Why spend weeks planting explosives underwater when one plane could drop a single bomb and level an entire city? The nuke did the same job with far less effort. Once the US had atomic weapons, the tsunami bomb idea quietly died. If you want to see more icebergs like this one, hit like, subscribe, and wait around for the next one.